YouTube streaming is being set up right now. As soon as it's on, I'll just have to mute it and then we can get to business.
Oh, yeah.
All right, we are live on YouTube. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for this entities themed tutorial. So already at the Digital Coptic Workshop, I think most of you were there or watched it later on YouTube, saw that there are new entity facilities. I was mainly talking about how reliable they are and what they are approximately in that presentation. But now I'd like to get more into the gritty details of how to actually work with these, both in the annotation interfaces, some aspects of the guidelines that might not be so clear, and later in the search and visualization tools. The focus will probably be on the middle part because a lot of you guys are annotating Coptic data, so it's important. And this is in fact important even if you don't annotate entities, because you need to know how to not break them when they're there and you're doing something else. Like you change tokenization, what happens to the entities? Right, so that's kind of important. So we're going to try to get through that. I'll start maybe with where you can find information about this. The first stop should always be the guidelines, which are, oh, hang on, I'm not sharing my screen. Here we go. The guidelines, which you can find on the Coptic Scriptorium website. So if you go to documentation, you'll always find the latest documentation. And the entity annotation guidelines are here. This is something that I've been working on together with Lance. And so you'll find the most details in here. They describe what it is exactly that we're even including in entity annotation. So for example, named entities, things like apapapnuta, of course, non-named entities as well, so things like the angel. We do not include pronouns. So any of you who might have worked on annotating pronouns in the past, that's not included in the current scheme, no pronouns. There are some quasi-pronominal expressions that we do include, and that's maybe important to note, things like, you know, pet constructions like pitwab. So that works very much like a noun, and we annotate those as people, for example, in the case of pitwab. Also, demonstrative pronouns like pi. The main reason for that is that we annotate appositions, and you'll see those in the markable selection guidelines. So this section of the guidelines, section 3, is all about what is one of those boxes supposed to include. So you'll notice there are things like appositions, like ro xenon is one guy. We don't annotate ro and xenon separately because it's the same guy. It's just an apposition, the king, xeno. And one of the reasons why we ended up including things like pi, even though it's quasi-pronominal, is you have cases of apposition with pi. So you'll have, you know, pnute, pi, entaf, blah, 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 blah. And this is one span again. So that makes the pi part of that. Kind of. A couple of constructions that are maybe worth spending time on. I think the most problematic one is the one with the copula. And this actually relates to the tagging guidelines. I don't even remember when we introduced this into the tagging guidelines, but there are pet constructions which we don't consider to be headed by an article. We actually tag these as copulas, and it's important for the parser and for a variety of other things. So this is something that I'd like to spend a minute going over just because it shows up and people don't know it well. So for example, in a phrase like petusotem erof, which is a person, it's pretty clear that pe is the article, right? It's the one that they listen to him. There are some pies, though, which look exactly the same, but if you think about it, are actually the copula. They're an apocopated copula, and you can find them in cases like this. Pnute pentafauxane. So this one is not an article. What's actually happening here is pnute pe ntafauxane, right? God is the one, blah, blah, blah. If you didn't think that this pi was a copula, there would be no is in the sentence. And in fact, it's even possible to have a sentence where this is an article if the sentence continues. You could have said, pnute pentafauxane u agathoste, right? Then it would be like pnute, comma, pentafauxane, like it would be an apposition. God, comma, the one who, blah, blah, blah. But whenever you can translate this pi as is, whenever you could extend it into saying pe, pause, and then say the rest of the sentence, essentially it's a copula and should be tagged and lemmatized as such. In the guidelines, you'll find a couple more confusable cases to demonstrate this. So you've got pnute, pentafauxane pe. You'll notice here we have two phrases, not one, even though these refer to the same thing, because this is the subject and this is the predicate. You could have also said pnute pe pentafauxane, right? So in this case, we have two person spans, one for the subject, one for the predicate, and then this P is the normal copula. Here's another example, Penjois, Pnute et sotem eron P. Right, our Lord is God who hears us. And because this P exists, you know that this one isn't the P. Right? So all of these are kind of confusing. Basically, try to think to yourselves, can you just kind of pause and extend it into a P? If you can, then, well, it's a copula, it's not an article. All right. So this is something that you can read in detail later on. This is probably the most confusing one and leads also to the most errors. Another question that I've gotten relatively frequently is what to do with interrupted spans. We include those with the interruption embedded into them. For example, nef apostolos ne etwab. So of course, this ne doesn't belong to the apostolos. It's not part of the apostles, but it's kind of stuck in the middle and you want to keep the etwab. So as a result, you just kind of bracket the whole thing, even though the ne doesn't belong to it. Right, and that's how you know that it's nef apostolos etwab, kind of ignoring the ne. All right, any questions about this part? Right, if you're ever in doubt about these things, there are a couple of other guidelines, what to do about collective nouns, like Wagele and Shosh, a herd of buffaloes, is a single animal span. There's not both herd and buffaloes. The buffaloes are the herd and the herd is the buffaloes. What to do about numbers, things like that. What to do about possessive constructions like pa Paulos is in fact annotated as two persons because there's Paulus and there's the one who is Paulus's. Okay, so at this point, I'll stop going over these in detail. Also of note is the entity types and what counts as what. So we have these 10 types here, which are abstract, the most common probably, which is the kind of other category, anything intangible. Person is the other very common category. Most of the things we have are abstracts and persons. Place is fairly self-explanatory. For person, I should maybe say that supernatural entities count as persons. So angels are annotated as person in this respect. Time terms like year, day, even moment. Events, sometimes these will be nominalized verbs. Sometimes they'll be nouns. So pmu, pmu and apapapnute is, the death of Paphnutius. That's an event. But you can also have, I don't know, tref sotem, the fact that they made him here. That's also an event. All right, at this point, I think I'm going to swap over to showing you how these things work out in GitDocs, unless there are questions about the guidelines. I recommend reading them. They're just like 10 pages. And once you've read through them, you'll know most of the doubtful cases. All right, next is how this figures into GitDocs. One of the things you'll notice in GitDocs if you've logged in recently is that there are now validation icons for entities and an entities mode. This is a third mode. And this mode is a little bit different from the relationship between the XML editor mode and the spreadsheet mode in that it's a two-way street. So you guys are probably used to doing your XML transcriptions in GitDocs and then moving on to the spreadsheet and never looking back. Right, so then the XML is burnt. Effectively, you'll never ever use it again. With the entities mode, actually changes you make to the entities annotation will get implanted into the spreadsheet, and changes to the spreadsheet can affect the entity annotations. And this is perhaps the most important point for this session, especially for those of you who are not even touching entities and just want to know how to not break things. So there are a lot of documents with entities in them. I'm going to pick one here. So this is the Martyrdom of Victor, part 2. The first thing to do if you're annotating entities is that there is now a status for that, so that I know that entity annotation is in progress. So I'm going to change its status to entities. And what you're seeing now is just a normal spreadsheet. I, in practice, tend to check some things in the spreadsheet before I do entity annotation, but I want to show you what happens if you don't. So let's just switch to entities mode here. This doesn't actually do anything, so it's always safe to do. Nothing has happened. It's just visualizing it differently. Namely, it's taking all of the norms in the text and just visualizing them like this. Right? This is the entire part 2 of Victor. And the way to get entities into this is to hit the auto NER button for named entity recognition. And it will add entity spans to everything. If it's a long text, it might take a few moments. And when you get this result back, the first thing to do is just have a sanity check and look at everything and see, does this make sense? Are there some weird blunders in here? And probably there will be some. How many of these will be? So you can kind of see the icons corresponding to the entity types that I mentioned. So Apa Victor is a person. That's why he gets this little person icon here. And the colors also encode the entity type. So all people are in blue now. Let's try to find something kind of egregiously wrong. So actually, this is surprisingly okay. So one of the things that typically goes wrong is, for example, this guideline with the copula. So what I'm going to do now, prepare a more broken one. Let's look for kind of penta constructions or something. Oh, here's one. This one's clearly broken. So, metet meweje ang Judas ho pentafti ebol impifjois, right? So there's this weird pi here that's been bracketed as a person. And then Judas ho, and this is general weirdness happening here. There's a high likelihood that there's a tagging error here. And so something has gone wrong. Or somewhere you might see somebody has misannotated an u that is a pronoun as an article, then sometimes it thinks that some new phrase starts with that u. I mean, when you look at it more closely, if you zoom out, it kind of looks sensible, but when you look at it more closely, you'll notice that there are actually some errors. And currently the error rate is, if you demand perfect spans, about 10%. If you just care about hitting the right entity type, including the main noun of the span, about 5%. So there's definitely corrections that you could do to improve this. So the reason I mentioned first looking at the spreadsheet before you doing this is kind of twofold. Part of it is to avoid true technical problems, and part of it is just to correct errors before you end up here, and then it's more difficult to correct them again. So if I switch back to spreadsheet mode right now, I haven't saved, so these entities will actually disappear. They won't be saved in any way. If I hit save, then they're going to get added to the spreadsheet, and they're pretty easy to remove from the spreadsheet if I want to. So I'm actually going to do that. I'm going to save. And so unlike the spreadsheet, it doesn't auto-update whenever you make a change. It just updates when you do save, and then it inserts those spans back into the spreadsheet. So they'll actually show up in the spreadsheet right now. If you want to live really dangerously, you can also have a second tab open with the same document in spreadsheet mode, and then you will see the spreadsheet change in real time. But that's kind of adventurous. Okay, so here's the spreadsheet. And get everybody's video feed out of my... So you can see that there's some new columns here called entity, and you'll notice there's 4 of them. If you're wondering why there are 4 columns, the reason for this is actually because of nesting. So for example, here we've got Teftrofepe, uoik, men, uhmu, and mate, right? So it's annotated mate as abstract and uhmu and mate as substance, but this is bigger, so it contains this other one here, which is why you need multiple columns. So cases that require 4 columns are probably going to be rare, but it's enough for there to be one, quadruply nested entity somewhere for it to need that level of depth. So there's all sorts of, I'm mainly seeing double nesting. Here's a triple one. So you've got payot ute teiment athet intastahok impo. Yeah, I think this is wrong. So this payot should probably just end. And if you wanted to correct things in spreadsheet mode, actually that will take effect. So let's say I decide I unmerge this using the yellow button and decide that the correct span is payot, that's fine. Right. And then it will actually update also in the other view. So because the spreadsheet is live updatable the way it's always been, any updates to the entity columns are going to take effect in the entity view as well. So when the entity view loads up, it just loads whatever spans it found in the spreadsheet, and it doesn't update. If you were to have these 2 tabs open concurrently, and then you made a change after you had opened entity mode, it wouldn't show up, and then you'd risk falling out of sync. So let's look at some of these For example, enta constructions. So para, penta. So if you have a preposition, it's not going to be the copula. So whenever you have a preposition before a pi, it can't be the copula. Para penta something. Horis penta something. This is the Judas thing. So anok ang Judas ho. So okay, this ho is of course not just an I'm mod, it's myself, right? As for me. So it's this. And the lemma is anok. Right? Everybody's familiar with these portmanteau tags, right? So it's so ho is just the first person form of ho. Which is inconvenient, but that's just how it is. And doing this will probably, if we were to rerun the automatic NER, it's not going to automatically kind of magically fix this stupid person here. That would only happen if you reran auto NER. Now, as soon as you rerun auto NER, it will erase any entities that you've done, including any manual corrections. So be a little bit wary of that. If you re-click auto NER, it will erase your work. However, if you don't hit save, it won't save that. So if you ever accidentally hit that button, just don't save. Just close the tab and reopen it. Right? As long as you don't save, nothing gets populated into the spreadsheet. As soon as you hit save, it takes those spans and implants them into the spreadsheet. All right, so I can actually fix this here as well. I can just do this because I've already run the NER and I don't feel like rerunning the system. If I go back to the entities view now, that UDAS error is going to be gone. Now, let me show you how to edit the actual entities in the entity interface, because I think most of the time you won't be working on the entities in the spreadsheet. The main thing you need to watch out when you're working in the spreadsheet is that you don't mess up the entities. And we all kind of know this from inserting tokens. Whenever you insert tokens and you worry not to destroy a diplomatic page break or a norm group or something like that and not leave gaps, it's exactly the same. You just have to kind of keep an eye on whether or not there are any entity spans that you're disrupting. Generally speaking, if you don't change the number of norms in the document, you have nothing to worry about. These problems can only occur if you're either adding norms or removing norms. So whenever you kind of drastically alter tokenization, the entities don't actually care. If you were to add a line in order to make this omega decorated and ecthetic and whatever, that wouldn't matter to the entities because it's below the level of a single norm. Similarly, if you group three norms differently, if you change the bound grouping and decide that Pashera Victor is one huge bound group, makes no difference to the entity annotation. The only thing that affects the entity annotation is where norms start and end, right? So in fact, let me be a little bit evil. I'm going to do this trick that I mentioned earlier, and I'm going to actually have that EtherCalc spreadsheet open in parallel to the entity annotation. I'm going to mess things up really badly so that you can see what happens. Let's look for morph. Morph is a good place to do this. I need a compound noun, mint something, or okay, mint. Great. Now, supposing I were to end this incorrect span, by the way, nf gene tekment kui should just be tekment kui, right? Since you're youth. So this is the correct span. If you look at it in the entities view, it's over here. You could have also corrected it here by dragging this border to the right and kind of setting it on tech. Okay, this is how you resize entities in the editor. You just drag this border and say, no, it's just the word tech. No, actually, it ends mint kui. And whenever you drag, you'll notice that you get this kind of green floating thing. And you can just drop it wherever you want. And if you drop it in the middle of a word, it will snap to the end of that word. Okay. And this also works across lines. So let's say that you want to say Pejaba Victor or something. So to add an entity, you can press either press this plus button after you mark something, Peja, or alternatively, you can also mark it. So you have this lasso kind of thing. You need to mark adjacent words. You can't have discontinuous entity. And then if you hit enter, it will add that entity. This is probably how I do it most often because it's fastest, so you don't have to zap back to this button here, the plus. And then you can decide what that is. Oh, it's an object. And then you want to drag it to include Abba Victor. That's not a problem. You can actually drag it to the next line. and it will contain apavictor. Now, one thing that you can't do is have conflicting spans. So logically, entities either contain each other or they don't. It doesn't make sense to have this entity, peje apa, but also apavictor. Everybody sees that would be a weird place to stop, right? If I do that, it will go invalid. It will not allow me to do that, right? So you also can't do this. You can't decide, oh, this goes on longer or something. You can't pull it out. Oh yeah, to delete them, I just hit the little X button here. And then you can restore apavictor. You can also control click several tokens and then just hit enter and that'll be a new entity. And click the icon to choose what it is. So this is going to be a person. All right. Okay, so now, remember I did this evil thing here. What I wanted to do is to decide that just Kui is an abstract and mint isn't. So now I have an entity that doesn't match any norm boundaries. This is fatal. Let's see what happens. I'm going to try to save. Saving will succeed because there's the same amount of norms. If you have a different amount of norms in this view and in the spreadsheet, saving will fail and it will say can't save different number of norms in entity view and spreadsheet. Whenever you see something like that, it means that somebody's altered the amount of norms in the spreadsheet while you were editing in entities mode, which is a very bad thing. Okay, but let's see what happened to my mint Kui thing. This is a relatively mild case, but however, a kind of misleading one. Oh, I'm sorry. Of course, I hit save and then it erased my sabotage there because the saving erased it. What I really intended to do was to switch this window into spreadsheet mode. And now I'm going to destroy it here. So see, it restored it because I had fixed it. What I'm going to do now is just the Kui. And now I'm going to return to entities mode. And this will actually make the interface go a little bit crazy. So if you ever see this happening, you'll know what happened. Probably see all the entities disappeared and you're maybe kind of panicking and saying, oh no, my half hour of work doing the entities on the end of the document is gone. Actually, it's not gone. The only thing that happened is it freaked out because it couldn't find a word corresponding to this Kui, and then it stopped visualizing altogether. But you can actually solve this pretty easily, and you can also tell where the problem is. It's the very next thing you annotated after pe lupe emok. This is, by the way, an error. MP lupe emok. This should be this is a negative past tense. It's not a noun phrase. Tenu MP lupe emok. It's not a noun. So we can actually correct both of these things together. And in fact, looking at the entities view and what gets annotated and not is a good way for spotting tagging errors as well, or segmentation errors, because you see that something is kind of nuts and you ask yourself why. And the answer is that the entity recognizer gets fed the part of speech tags. So they kind of mislead it in this case. And indeed, if you were to find this lupe, which is the last known good thing that happened, you'll quickly find that the very next entity annotation is broken. If you fix it, the problems will go away, either removing it just, or if you want, you can also just move it to the correct position here. Now it's fixed. I can also fix the loop if I want. So now I'm going to do something bold and fix tokenization, right? This should be drastic. However, remember, you're now in spreadsheet mode, which is kind of the master mode. And as long as you don't create any broken entities that don't contain exactly some norm boundaries, everything's going to keep working. So I can actually do this now. So all of us who have worked on this before in spreadsheet mode know what I'm doing right now, right? MP, emp, lemma. So this is mpe, this is anok. Bound groups stay the same. I'm going to adjust the token layer as well. And finally, the tagging. This is a negative past tense, pronoun, verb. And I should probably remove this event. Now, you don't have to. You can leave this event, and you'll notice that it actually corresponds to norm boundaries. That's not going to crash everything. If I switch now and don't erase it there, it's just going to show up in the entities view. It doesn't care that it's surrounding a verb. There's no rule against that, per se. It's just that the entity recognizer tends not to tag verbs as entities, but, you know, there's nothing technically prohibiting it. Let's find that loopy now. This one. It's not really an now. It really looks kind of weird. And I'm just going to remove it. So this view is also really good for spotting normalization errors. If you see nomina sacra abbreviations, if you see superlinear strokes in the screen, anything non-normie that you see in the screen, you know you have some normalization error, right? Because this is all just based on the sequence of norms. It doesn't care about anything else. It doesn't know about anything else. And when you save, it can't influence anything else. It can only influence those layers that it has access to. But whenever you save, it does get merged into the spreadsheet, so it's going to alter the spreadsheet, namely the entities columns. Okay, now let me show you a couple of other kind of convenience tricks. First of all, I should point out that depending on what kind of document it is, sometimes it's useful to be able to see this big mess of things because it's relatively small. So you can kind of run your eyes over it pretty quickly. But if you want to be really systematic, and especially if you're aiming for very high quality entity annotation, it could be easier to go sentence by sentence. And that's what this button here is for. Now, this button exploits the presence of the translation span. It does not work if you don't have translation spans. But if you do, it will divide everything according to translations. And if you hover over the sentence number, you'll also get the translation itself, which is really helpful for deciding what the entities were. So if I didn't remember that humu is salt, you can check. So I think mate is probably not an entity at all here. It just means just. And in any case, it's not part of a humu. So I'm going to move this here and maybe kill this one. Right? But seeing the translation can help you kind of realize all that. So you can just go over this, look at the translation, and figure out what's going on. All right, that's one thing. These other two buttons, you're never going to need in normal kind of day-to-day practice. They're mainly for format stuff. So you can export into various formats here if you want to export just the entity annotation. And if you're an administrator, you'll also have access to this import button. This allows you to violently overwrite the entity annotation using another entity annotation file. You can use this to do named entity tagging experiments. Like you have 3 taggers and you want to quickly see what their output does to the entity annotation. Whatever you paste in here will replace the existing entity annotations. Again, without saving, nothing will happen to the spreadsheet though. All right, are there any questions so far? Another thing about sentences is that you can't actually make entity spans across sentences. First of all, it would break this view. Second of all, logically, it would be weird if an entity goes across sentences. So if you try to do that, it will refuse. Can't add a span across sentences. And even though they're not shown here, this is actually true here as well. So where was I? It was this politea here. It knows where the sentences are, and it's going to do can't add a span across sentences. So if you ever see that, switch on this view and see, wait, where are my sentence boundaries? Are they good? And then you might want to go into spreadsheet mode and fix the sentence boundaries, which are the translation boundaries. All right, that's not essential by itself, but this is another way in which you'll notice errors by virtue of doing entity annotation. It just kind of reveals a lot of stuff that go, well, why did it do this? Oh, because some underlying annotation was wrong. All right. So for example, I just noticed that this arip metwe is wrong. And I can't fix that without switching back to spreadsheet view because it would change the number of norms. I can't do it in my evil parallel thingy here. If I attempted to do that, so this is kind of the really bad sort of thing that could happen. This is kind of a waste of my time. Okay, I don't want to do this. If I do this and try to save, it'll just say save failed. And then we'll refuse to save this stuff until the spreadsheet has the same amount of norms as the entities view. If you're ever worried about losing your work and you know you're going to do substantial tokenization changes, first of all, remember that these spans remain here, right? So until it succeeds in saving, it won't overwrite these things. They'll still be here. Also, if you want to get rid of all entities in a document because they annoy you, you just have to delete these columns and they'll be gone, right? Because they're literally saved in these columns here. All right, the next thing I want to go over is named entity linking. This is kind of important because it's one of the ways in which this data will become most visible in Coptic Scriptorium. So named entity linking works using this button, list named entities. And this button only works if you've already got entity annotations in the document. If you have no entity annotations, it won't do anything. So I'm going to hit it. And it will attempt, oh, did I already go over this? I'm sorry, this is Abraham our father. This is already done. We were doing martyrdom of Victor. Right, so if I press this button, you'll see that there's a lot of stuff that it considers to be named entities, but none of them are identified. So the first thing to do when you hit the list named entities button is to check whether all of these things are in fact named entities. There's not that many usually, so it's pretty easy to do. Pajois Jesus Christos looks good, however, it's not abstract. Everybody sees that? So something went wrong here. Let's look for it here. Here it is. Okay, so we'll change this to being a person. That's a good thing to do. What else? Israel is okay. Diabolos, Paganios de Apavictor. Apavictor. So remember, the interruption is okay by our guidelines. You have to allow it. Joyce Jesus Bechristos and tok etson and ta prohairesis. I guess this is actually a phrase because assuming he's talking to Jesus, it's okay, right? So it's part of the Jesus phrase. Oh, Jesus, Lord, you who, blah, blah. It's all one big apposition. Romanos, Pestratelates, Satanas, Pashere Victor, Moses, Romanos, Jesus, Pilatos, de Pegemon, Apollon Nocenute, Victor, Psach Paulos, Apollon, Chere, and Basiletes. Actually, Chere and Basiletes is weird because she is not named. And you see what happened. The reason why it thinks this is a named entity is because it missed Basiletes himself. So to fix this, we simply have to add Basiletes. Great. Now we'll stop recognizing that. Euhaios, Eleutheros. Eleutheros is not a named entity. This is probably because it's been tagged. First of all, it should probably Lethosten paratere erok mene. It's also not hos rome eleutheros. I think this is like a Greek adjective construction. It's a free man. Like normally you'd expect him to say in eleutheros. But anyway, it's one span. This suggests that probably we have tagged this incorrectly as nprop. I can probably find it in the spreadsheet. And I'm going to fix it right here, kind of brazenly. The reason I can do that is because it doesn't change the amount of norms, and because the entity spreadsheet interface doesn't really interact in terms of part of speech. So I can change parts of speech all day long, and it won't do anything to the entity annotation. So I'm just going to fix this to being non-named. Back here. Judas ho pentaf ti ebolem pef jois Diocletianos pef shere victor. Okay, everything is okay. I'm going to hit save one last time. The reason I'm hitting save now is for it to fetch the updated part of speech tags and everything that I fixed in the spreadsheet, because it won't fetch from the spreadsheet until I reload. And I fixed something, so I want to save. And now I'm going to go back to the named entities button. And now you'll see that all of our problems are gone. There's no longer the weird abstract Jesus because he's been fixed to being a person. So all the Jesuses are now under person where they should be. You'll also notice that this is type-based, meaning this interface asks you once to identify who Jesus is. But probably Jesus is written many times in the text. So this is not token-based, this is type-based in the sense that every unique named entity string appears only once. This also means that there is no way of tagging two different Johanneses referring to, once it's John the Apostle, once it's John the Baptist. If they're both referred to exactly as Johannes, currently the interface has no way of saying, oh, the first one is John the Baptist. This hasn't really bothered us yet because it's fairly unlikely to have two named entities being referred to with exactly the same string in the same document referring to different people. But if you ever have that, do talk to me. Right now, the interface doesn't support it. The reason is that it's just much faster to do this type-based, and it's nearly always right. Now, the next button you want to press is guess identities. This is always a good idea. The reason is not necessarily because you trust or don't trust. It's not that I needed this to tell me who Jesus is. The reason is because the identity identifiers, the links, are actually the names of Wikipedia articles. And I could not have necessarily known what the name of the Wikipedia article for Judas is. But if it guesses Judas Iscariot, and if you know that this guy is that Judas, then now you're very certain that this is the correct wiki link because somebody's already annotated it before. Right. You can also just start typing. I think it's some kind of Judah let's see, we have Judah, son of Jacob, Judas Iscariot. It's a couple of Judah containing things. It's this one. And you'll notice there are different colors here. What do they mean? White means no guess has been entered yet. Blue means the computer has guessed and is waiting for you to click check to say that this is correct. For example, diabolos, the computer guesses devil and it's correct, so I'm going to hit that. Now it's yellow, meaning it's been approved by a human. A human has looked over this, but it hasn't been saved yet. If you hit save entity linking, it'll get saved and become white, meaning it's now saved, right? But the blue ones have not been saved. They're not saved. Because of the kind of tricky nature of identity linking and how high profile it is, we basically don't want to accept any computer guesses until a human has looked at them. So now we say, okay, yeah, it's Jesus, sure. You can save those. You can save as often as you like. It doesn't really matter. Now, up a victor, you'll notice is pass. What does pass mean? Pass, if correct, means there is no Wikipedia article about this person. In this case, because Alpha Victor is a very short string, you can guess that this is probably correct. And because this is Victor document 2, you can pretty much guess that somebody in Victor document 1 already checked, discovered that Victor doesn't have a Wikipedia document, and therefore entered pass. Right. So all these Victors are pass. Israel is Israelites. I should point out that there are different entities for Israel depending on whether you mean the kingdom of Israel or the children of Israel. So if it's Israel, the organization, so ethnonyms are considered organization in the annotation scheme. So Romans, Israelites, and so on are organization. And the link for Israel as an organization is Israelites, which is a Wikipedia article. So all of this stuff you'll discover really corresponds to Wikipedia articles. This is Israelites. Whereas the kingdom of Israel, if you had a location, is a different article, the biblical kingdom of Israel. Satan, oddly, you'll notice that Satan and the devil are not the same guy. We debated this a little bit when we were preparing the gold standard corpus and decided to err on the side of not having opinions. What do I mean by that? You've probably encountered a couple of times in the project where we said some guideline is robotic in order to prevent disagreement. The entity linking guidelines are exactly like that. If there are two separate Wikipedia articles, one called Satan and one called devil, then Satan and the devil are separate entities. Not because we necessarily endorse this as theologically correct or really useful for our users or whatever, but just in order to remove this discussion. You want to know the answer? Check whether there's a Wikipedia article. And in fact, Satan is not, for whatever reason, the same as the devil. So we've got Satan, also known as the devil, and then there's a totally separate Wikipedia page about the devil. If you're wondering whether this happens often, I have to say no. This is the only one so far that I've had where I went like, why are we splitting this entity into two? Well, the reason is this. So Satan and the devil are currently split. Romanos, the general, also doesn't have a Wikipedia article. If something really annoys you that it doesn't have a Wikipedia article, by the way, feel free to add a Wikipedia article and then link. I actually did this because I wanted to check how easy it would be. There's this place mentioned in the Apophthegmata. Didn't have a Wikipedia article, and so I added it. And I swear those Wikipedia people, the editors had this up and approved within less than 24 hours. And with pointers, and they added that it's an article about Egyptology. I didn't add this. Like they categorized it for me. They were super helpful. The only thing I should point out if you want to do this is generally to add an article to Wikipedia, you need at least 3 sources. So I added 3 sources. And then, for good measure, I added a 4th source, which is data.Coptic Scriptorium, where you can read about this place or where it's mentioned. Right? So I think it'd be nice. Maybe in the future, we could even consider a project adding some backlinks into Wikipedia. We talked about it a little bit on the workshop. So we could do that. All right, I've got my Jesus, I've got my Moses, Victor again, who's unidentified, Romanos is unidentified. Apollon, Pnoch, and Penute, Apollo, yes. Victor, Psach, Paulos is Paul the Apostle. Apollo, Basiletes, Ohaios, I don't know who these people are. Diocletian, so Diocletian is identified, Victor, and we are left with one that didn't have a guess. And actually all the guesses were correct. This is typical. The reason why all the guesses are correct is simple, because this is Victor part 2. Victor part 1 had a lot of new entities. As soon as we identified all of them, they're going to appear in Victor Part 2, and there's going to be one new one, which is Pontius Pilatus, I assume. And I'm pretty sure he has an article. So you can see that in terms of using it as a table of authorities, what really makes Wikipedia good is it's super easy to find the right article about something. It's not difficult. And you don't need to decide whether something is prominent enough to be a linked entity. If it has a Wikipedia article, yes, that's the rule. And we're done. Okay, so what to do next? If you don't want to look at the entities at all anymore because you're busy and you have other stuff to do and there's 50 documents to work on, add a metadatum called entities automatic. We all know these quality metadata, right? Second thing to add is identities, and this will be checked. The reason why it's not gold is because while we did make sure that all of these entities are correct, we didn't actually read the text to check that we didn't miss any. If you want it to be gold, in order to allow yourselves to put gold in identities, which is this linking metadata field, you need to actually read the document and make sure that all of the entities that are mentioned are also in the table, right? Sometimes it's tagging errors. So for example, Satanas and Diabolos in our guidelines are nprop. Sometimes they're left as n. And this is actually one of the things that's worth checking before you run the NER, is these kind of common error gotchas that you know. Diabolos, nprop. Great. Ooh, here's an n. There you go. And as I mentioned, it's enough that one mention is nprop for it to make it into the list, so that's fortunate. But as I mentioned, changing part of speech tags is not a problem. You can do that at any time. It doesn't mess up the entities at all. So this is a little bit cavalier. What I'm doing here, working in 2 modes concurrently and stuff. You might not want to start that way. You might want to switch so that you're very sure that you don't have 2 things going on. But really, the only way that you could break something is if you change the norms or have an entity that's smaller or doesn't mesh up with norm boundaries. And even if you do have that, it's fixable. Right? As long as you didn't save an empty interface that deleted all your interface entities, it's not going to erase them. They're just going to stay there in the spreadsheet and the spans will be messed up and you have to fix wherever you messed it up. Lastly, you'll want to validate. And identities. Wait, what? Maybe I didn't save yet. So you see that it said that only 3 out of 22 entities have been identified. That's probably because I didn't save yet. And so the entity validation icon will be gray if no entities have been entered. It will be green if all entities have been identified, and will be red if some of them are not yet identified. So this should be valid now. Something here is wrong. This is a bug. I'm going to need to check what is its problem exactly. But other than that, this should be okay. If you don't have any identities, this can be, especially if you have a very short document. Let's look at a short app of them. So this one has none. And then the only thing you need to do is confirm no named entities. Right? This means that a human has asserted there's nobody named in this. And you're done. And then we'll just say, 0 out of 0 entities identified. Entity annotations is valid, 0 out of 0 identified. All right. Oh yeah, I didn't do one last thing. I didn't commit it to GitHub. So if you're committers, and not everybody's a committer, but if you have committer rights and you want to save this for posterity, you'll see that it thinks for some reason that not everything is identified. That's why it's red. I'm not sure why this bug is happening, but I'll check it out later. The last thing that you should do is commit. So you can do something like, so this hasn't been committed since March. And we actually also corrected things. So I'm going to enter added entities and corrections. Commit. And now we're done. So this is how you would add entity annotation stuff, and also some notes on how not to break things. What else can I tell you about? I promised that this would be the most kind of biggest part of this overview, but I said in the beginning that there are also some aspects of visualizing and using this stuff. Some of them are already available to you in the tree bank. So for example, you can query entities in ANIS. And some of them are upcoming. They're going to be inside the data scriptorium interface. So this is still a test. Initially, I thought I'd have a separate visualization for entities, but it became kind of clunky to have so many different visualizations. So my current plan is actually to fold it into the analytic visualization. And so you'll be able to see the entities here, right? So this is Abraham, our father. You know, Noju Bol and Polis, these are all places. And if you find these annoying and you just want the old view back, you can just turn them off. So this is a bit more interactive now. You can have just entity types. You can also turn on the wiki links. And if you're reading with wiki links, you can actually know who these people are. For Jesus, that's probably not super useful. But you know, for other things that you might not know, let's find something a bit more arcane. Well, this is Beelzebub. Hit Wikipedia, and you'll see that it's Beelzebub. Right. So as you read these things, you're able to kind of, you know, if a reader wants to know who this thing is or what this place is, they're all going to be highlighted in yellow and have their entity type. And if you hover over them, it'll tell you the name of the Wikipedia article, which allows you to kind of say, oh, this part is talking about Jesus. And you can also make this a lot more compact if this is, you know, if you don't need the translations, you can turn off the translations or chapters or verses or whatever, and it'll start getting slimmer and slimmer. You can also, if you are annoyed by the part of speech, but do want the interlinear translation, you can just turn off the part of speech. And this is kind of an interlinear translation view. Right. There's also a kind of aggregated metadata with all the people and place names. So far, I've restricted this to people and places because I thought it would get too kind of junky if it has too many things. So you'll notice that there's a metadatum people, Beelzebub, Jesus, Paul the Apostle. They're just in alphabetic order. And there's also places, Garden of Eden. So this document mentions the Garden of Eden. Now, you don't need to enter these metadata. They're automatically generated by GitDocs during export. So never edit these metadata, never look at them, never do anything with them. They just get there automatically. And they are the source of these rubrics here, people and places. So now you can do things like, yeah, I want to know all documents that may mention Abel, right? So this test instance just has eagerness, Abraham, and AP in it. So there's not too many things yet. But you can already see that it's quite a list of people. I think a lot of them are biblical. So Wikipedia tends to have pages for most characters in the Bible. But, you know, this is Mother Sarah of the desert, right? Makaria Sara. She's mentioned. She actually has a Wikipedia article. This is the diplomatic, right? If you go into the analytic, you'll discover that she's right here. And Sarah of the desert. There she is. So this kind of allows you to explore more easily what people and places are mentioned in things. Places a bit more sparse. Of course, there are also mythical places. So you get Garden of Eden, Gehenna, Duat. I didn't even know this word, but it's Aminta. Duat is the Egyptian name of Aminta. If you go to it, analytic. I mean, this is kind of cool because this text doesn't even have a translation. And yet you can do this kind of content-based search of what all is mentioned in it, in a text that nobody has actually ever translated potentially before. So you can just go and see, this is Satan, and here's Amenta. And indeed, there's this whole article about the Egyptian underworld. This took me a moment to find because I was expecting it under Amenta, but this is the name of the Wikipedia article. So this is the kind of visualization interface. The other parts of it are the dictionary and ANIS linking. You'll find all of this stuff in all of those places. For the dictionary, it's pretty modest. There are two main consequences of the entity annotations for the dictionary. So first of all, if something has entity types, so you'll get that Rome is human, right? And then you can find attestations of this person as a person. I mean, that sounds kind of boring because it's all of them. For some words, it's a little bit more interesting. For example, for won, so won nim, right, or something like that, you'll notice that it's attested in 4 entity types. And if you want to know, wait, when in the world does won mean a plant? You want to know, click it. And now you can know. So this is now linked to the dictionary and like any attested. So this is still beta. It's not live, but it will be in the next dictionary release, which is hopefully going to happen in a few days. So you can check this one, and sure enough, MP he e won. So I came seeking for fruit on this fig tree, and I have found none. And so this none is a fruit, and therefore classified as a plant. Fair enough, right? And so you can just link from the dictionary. Of course, you could have just done that search to begin with in ANIS. So you can absolutely enter entity types, and these will be present in all corpora after the upcoming release. Some of them from automatic entities, some from checked, some from gold. And you can do things like, so there are a couple of fields that you can use. Entity, you can just look for all plants. Some of them are kind of kewa, hinkue. So this is the parable of the mustard seeds, I guess. Karpos, bilbilin shiltem, right? You can also search for the identities. So if you wanted to find all phrases containing, I don't know, the devil, or so this is the devil in the tree bank, which is not too many times. Or I guess the tree bank now contains the book of Ruth. So there's lots of, oh, right, because it's not Ruth. So this is a limitation. You need to know what the article is called. It's not called Ruth. It's called, I believe, Ruth Biblical Person. You can use regex to kind of get around this, or just look for her name once and figure out, oh, she's called Ruth Biblical Figure. There you go. And if you click that, there you are. So this is now in the grid. The lemma field still links to the dictionary, not to the entity. And currently there's still this separate entities view, but I'm going to swap that out for this merged entities plus analytic view, because there's just too many pluses here already. The NLP service also contains entities now. So if you do anything in the NLP service, you'll see them added. You can turn it on and off here. And you can also, there's a new visualization for the parses. If you're curious about why certain annotation errors occur in terms of span length, very often it's because of the syntax tree, which you're able to view here as well. So this is kind of, this doesn't really change anything that the NLP does. It's just, here's your output, and the entities are visualized here. And these are syntax trees for that, for each sentence. I don't know if there's much else to show. In the dictionary, I guess I didn't show the entity graphs, which are kind of cool. So if you search for a noun now, possibly even for a verb already, you can kind of look for what types of words are included in these entity terms. There's this new button here, phrase network graph. And if you click that, you'll start seeing the words that form entities headed by Rome. So Rome, usually continued by in. Then if it's in, then very often dikaios. And the thickness of these arrows corresponds to how often that path is taken. And the size of the nodes is how often that node is used, regardless of what path it was reached by. And this is based on the entity annotation and syntax trees. So Rome et and what? Shone. So a man who is sick. What sick? Sick, very sick. And you can kind of follow these different pathways across the annotations. There's also an experimental verb visualization. It's a little bit trickier because we don't have entity annotation to be sure what sense of the verb we're talking about. So this has a little bit more errors in it probably. But you can kind of see, so this is now, and you can see that there's now e, now ero, now j. So you can see that. And this one surprised me. Now unhimhal. And I thought, surely that's an annotation error. You can't see someone in Coptic. You only see two people, right? And then I just went to Anis and I went, you know, is there And there is such stuff. Okay, this is shop now. I'm sorry, I should have specified verb. So a wish now in himhal impnute. I want to see direct object in himhal impnute. Or maybe it's of a servant or something, but it's annotated as an article. I guess it pretty much looks like a direct object, right? I want to see the servants of God. Anyway, so this is the kind of query that you can do now. You can also search for specific head nouns. So you can do something like, there's this new head annotation, which is an arrow operator, just like the dependencies. And you can say, oh, I want, give me all entities headed by Rome. And you'll get them. In Rome, in Rome, and now it's still visualized by bound groups, so it looks a bit weird. But if you put it into norms, you'll see the exact span. And you can also export these if you want. I think somebody chatted something. Feel free to also word few enough that you can also just talk if you want. Okay,
Yeah, I just have to leave. I gotta go to work. So.
All right, that's fine.
Yep. Thank you.
Oh yeah, okay. This has also been going on for about an hour, so I'm gonna stop here. This last part was more fun stuff than necessities. So yeah, what do you guys think? Do you have questions, feedback, anything at all? I can also turn off the streaming if you'd be more comfortable. We'll adjourn the tutorial part of this. The stream is going to stop now.